President Barack Obama released an op-ed in the Washington Post where he states that he will take action against solitary confinement for juveniles. In fact, he plans on banning it for juveniles. Now, he writes that there are as many as 100,000 people held in solitary confinement in U.S. prisons, including juveniles and people with mental illnesses. As many as 25,000 inmates are serving months, even years of their sentences alone in a tiny cell with almost no human contact. And then he talks about the psychological impact of being held in solitary confinement for extended periods of time. He says it has been linked to depression, alienation withdrawal, a reduced ability to interact with others, and the potential for violent behavior. Some studies indicate that it can worsen existing mental illnesses and even trigger new ones. Prisoners in solitary are even more likely to commit suicide, especially juveniles and people with mental illnesses. Now, he mentioned that the Justice Department completed a review of some of the practices within our justice system, and he says, I'm adopting its recommendations to reform the federal prison system. So again, this is just the federal prison system. These include banning solitary confinement for juveniles and, as a response to low-level infractions, expanding treatment for the mentally ill and increasing the amount of time inmates in solitary can spend outside of their cells.
So humans are social animals. If you put us in solitary confinement where we can't talk to anyone else, we lose our minds. That's basically what happens. And that's why so many of the people who've been in solitary confinement for too long wind up committing suicide. In fact, they have trouble relating to other human beings if they stay in there long enough. They can't even hug babies. And you'd think they'd want to do that more when they come out, but their mind gets warped in there because we are social creatures. And so it is an extraordinary punishment, and it should be reserved for extraordinary circumstances. President Obama, by the way, says we're not taking it away entirely. Right? There are some situations where you really got to get him under control. You got to get him away from other people so he doesn't hurt them, etc. We all understand that, right? But he said to do this systematically, to do it at the levels that we have done it, and to do it to kids are all, and I love this line, he said, it is an affront to our common humanity. I think that's exactly right. Now, of course, conservatives will look at that and go, oh, soft on crime, we got to protect the guards at the prisons. Now, that's why he explains, wait a minute, if you actually look at the data, every time they have reduced solitary confinement in different state prisons, for example, I'll give you one example, right? Colorado cut the number of people in solitary confinement, and they did it by, New Mexico also did it, they cut it by 25%. And you know what happened? It significantly reduced the attacks against the staff. So it actually led to less violence if you did less solitary confinement. Because once you've lost that connection to the rest of humanity, well, then you're a danger not only to yourself because of all the suicides, but to others as well. They come out of solitary confinement as madmen if you keep them long enough. I mean, one of the poor kids that he talks about, a 16-year-old Khalif Browder in the Bronx, was accused of stealing somebody's backpack. They never even tried him.
They never tried him. He served 3 years in prison for that, waiting for a trial. They put him in solitary confinement for the majority of time.
For over 2 years in solitary confinement. And he comes out, he goes and attends college for a while, and then he killed himself because you lose your mind.
Yeah.
So now when you've got people who lose their minds, they're already in prison, how do you think they're going to react to the staff, right, and to the prison guards? Well, we don't have to guess. We already know the data's in. They attack them more, right? So if you want to reduce violence in prisons, you have less solitary confinement, not more. So this is, in fact, an absolute no-brainer. Everyone should agree to this.
It's a no-brainer. I like that Obama is trying to make some reforms and some changes in our justice system before his term is up. But at the same time, you have to ask the question of what the whole point of our justice system is for. I mean, there's the punitive component of it, which I completely understand. There should be a punitive component of it. But there's supposed to be a rehabilitative component to it as well. And unfortunately, that component doesn't even exist anymore. And so when you have prisoners like Chelsea Manning who get threatened with solitary confinement because they have the magazine with, Caitlyn Jenner's cover on it, well, then you have to ask, why do we have solitary confinement? Is it for violent criminals that pose a threat to other inmates? Or is it just a way of, punishing anyone who does anything that you disagree with while they're behind bars?
And look, that's also a no-brainer because Chelsea Manning isn't threatening anyone in that particular case. We know that. That's a fact, right? She wasn't threatening any of the other inmates or the guards. She just violated the rules, right? So now if you say, well, there should be a punitive aspect of it, and I don't like that she revealed government secrets and yada, yada. But the punitive aspect is her prison sentence. You're already punishing her. So then to say, oh, no, we're just going to throw her in solitary confinement for the smallest infractions, well, then you've set up an inhumane system. I would argue that it even violates the Eighth Amendment against cruel and inhuman punishment, right? And so that's what we have here. It's way past time. Now, I'm going to be a little unfair to President Obama. So it turns out he could have done this all along. Like, with about a year left in his term, he's like, oh, yeah, it turns out I could do this with executive order. Okay, there's a lot of pressure. And by the way, now the pressure is a little bipartisan. A lot of Republicans have come around to this. So finally, now that the Republicans agree, President Obama finally goes, oh, yeah, I guess I could have done this anytime I wanted. Sure, right?
It is frustrating, especially when you read his op-ed and you get to the part where he talks about low-level drug offenders. And it reminds you of the fact that he very openly confessed to smoking marijuana when he was in college, and he suffered no consequences for that. But we have so many people behind bars with insane prison sentences because of marijuana.
And by the way, if you ask, can President Obama do anything about that? Well, right now, marijuana is a Schedule I drug, which is insane. President Obama could fix that like this. That's totally doable at the executive level. He could fix it today if he wanted to. He still has chosen not to do so. Now, again, credit where credit is due. I love that he did this. Overall, wonderful news. So I don't want to take away from that too much. And I'm just going to note, one more skepticism about the Republicans. Again, they're coming to the right side, so bless their hearts. Overall, that's 90% of it. The 10% President Obama mentions, well, look, we spend $80 billion a year to imprison people in this country. $80 billion. And 2.2 million people are incarcerated. We've broken all records across the world. The Chinese, the Iranians, they don't imprison. The Saudis, they don't imprison people at the rate that we do, which is unbelievable. So the Republicans are a little worried about the cost. But, I mean, drugs, say no to drugs, war on drugs, etc. Why all of a sudden they're starting to have this change of heart? They're willing to spend money on wars. They've been willing to spend money on prisons. You know what's happening? All the pharmaceutical companies got people hooked on all these drugs. And now there's a heroin epidemic, which is affecting white people.
Yes.
All of a sudden, wait a minute. Do we really need to keep all these guys in prison for all this time?
Yes. I love it. I love that you mentioned that because no one's on that, right? So, and it makes me so furious because you have people like Jeb Bush all of a sudden getting very empathetic when it comes to those that are addicted to drugs, right? And it's because those who are addicted to heroin are predominantly white. Okay.
And by the way, one of his kids had a drug issue, so it's now all of a sudden they feel it. Republicans are like, wait, my family members had a drug issue. A lot of my constituents are having drug issues. Drugs, it's not just for black people. Which, by the way,
come on, give them a break.
Come on, give me a break. Right? Okay. By the way, it was never just for black people. Of course not, or Latinos. It was just enforced that way. But now that all these white people are actually going to prison, they're like, oh, maybe not such a great idea.
Exactly.
So we're getting to the right places, maybe for some unfortunate reasons. But hey, in the end, I'll take it.